So this is a shot that a student is trying to render, and they were wondering a couple of things. One, how is the lighting looking? How does it feel? So for anyone who's curious, this is the unlit version right there. And then you have the lit version. Definitely adds a lot. It adds a cool layer of depth, and it just kind of feels more complete in a sense. So they were wondering what it looks like and then how to speed up the renders later. So first of all, let's go over how does it look? Well, overall, it looks pretty good. The main thing when you're looking at renders, and the thing that I tend to look for, is visual contrast and how does it help push the scene. So like I was talking about camera moves, the camera move should help enhance the scene. Lighting should help enhance the scene, not pull away from it. The problem with this lighting right now is it's taking away from the scene. It's adding cool elements like the subsurface scattering on the skin. It looks really nice. You've got the reflection on the counter that looks cool. You've got this like texture on the record player that's really nice. There's these elements that add so much. But if you look at it as a whole, what stands out when you look at this? If you kind of squint your eyes a little bit and look at the image, what really pops? Nothing. Nothing is standing out. It all just kind of merges together. That's because we don't have any areas that stand out in terms of highlights. All the lighting is kind of even, and the colors are all kind of even. Everything has this very warm color, so these more orangish shades to things. Even the blue shirt here is a very warm blue, and it creates this evenness to everything. So as we look at this, it's very hard for the character to stand out, and our eyes tend to wander on these images. Now here, this is working a little bit better. Here we have cooler colors in the background while the character is warmer. It makes the character stand out just a little bit more. So my main note on these would be to push that contrast, both in light intensity and color contrast. So for example here, put a rim light. You've got a little bit of one right here. Make that stronger. Have it so we can see a little bit of a rim light on the face here, even on the hand. Push the foreground lighting to be more powerful than the background lighting here, so the background kind of fades into shadow. The only area that should be a little bit more intense is the clock. The clock right now is so dark that we're not looking at it at all. That should pop out a little bit more. And maybe change the material on the glass so it's a little clearer to see. The reflection is cutting right at the numbers, and it's very hard to see the hands of the clock. So just as an example here, if you just do a Google search for, I did film lighting examples. Look at the lighting here and see how intense the lighting can be at times. So this is kind of an evening scene right here. Look at that lighting, how bright it is on this side of the face compared to the other. We get this really strong highlight. What that does is it helps to break the character away from the background. So we get the background here and then strong highlight, and it creates contrast from one side to the next. So this is a black and white example, but the same thing. You feel that really strong contrast between the rim light, or backlight as it can be called, your key light, which is your main light direction, and then your fill light, which basically just fills the shadows. So you want that contrast, that visual oomph to the lighting. So for example, this one is feeling a little flat to me, mostly because all of the skin tones are blending into everything else. There's nothing that makes the character stand out. Whereas this, that extra little rim light on her shoulders here, that extra little key light on her face, makes her stand out compared to the background. So what I normally do when I'm trying to figure out, okay, how can I push my lighting? is I'll just look up a scene from a film that is similar to the feeling that I want. So in the case of the example here, it's a shot that's kind of feels like nighttime, maybe late evening, and the character's kind of getting ready for just cleaning the house. So just if you know a scene from a film that has that same kind of feeling, like nighttime, just moving around the house, look for examples of that. You can just do Google searches like this. I did another one like just sitcom living rooms, because that maybe we want it to feel kind of like a sitcom. Well, if we look at this, we can see how do they light the scenes in here. Now you'll see the lighting is much more even in a sitcom. We don't have that super dynamic range because the characters have to be able to move everywhere on their set, but you still get the rim lights on one side, nice fill, and the characters pop from the background. They don't blend into the background. That's a key feature here. So, like, look at how much these characters, a lot of it's the clothing, the colors of the clothing, they stand out from the background. I think I saw an example here where a character was kind of blended in a little bit more. Which one was it? Even here, you can see that the lighting's a little bit more even, but you still get that rim on the shoulders there, and they stand out. So in terms of the lighting, those are my two big notes. Really try to push that visual contrast. It doesn't mean that the character has to be one bright color and the background has to be a totally different color, but try to push the values in there. And I'll show an example of how you can visually see that in Maya and make it a little easier to determine whether that's happening or not. And then push your rim lighting on the character to make them pop out from the background just a little bit more. It's not going to look realistic because technically rim lighting doesn't happen all the time. It has to be set up, but it's just going to make the character a little bit more visually appealing. One other note is make sure that the intensity isn't drawing our eyes away from certain areas. So for example, here, we're getting this very bright light on the outside of the window. That's where we're going to look. When this shot is playing through, our eyes are attracted to bright spots. So if I bring up my lighting here, for example, let's do this. It hurts. The brightness is where you're going to want to look. The brightest spot. Even if I tone this down and let's see, do I have something here? Something white. So if I have this, you can see how bright that is in the light. Where do you want to look? At the shiny thing, at the bright thing. Our eyes are attracted to points, like ends of things, anything that points, and to highlights. So in this case, we want to make sure that the character and this area is kind of the brightest or most in focus. So tone down that lighting. You could even just turn it off. It doesn't really make sense if this is a nighttime scene. Where is this bright light coming from? Is it a vehicle that's pulling into the driveway? If so, that lighting would have to be animated, but it still takes away from the scene and doesn't really make sense with the rest of the story that I've seen in here. Same thing here. Brightest spot is up there and up here, which is taking away from this area here. Same thing here. These windows draw our attention to them. So really watch where you are putting that intensity of the light. And then right here, this specular color right here feels a little odd. The fact that it's tan, it should be white. Specular color, that's the color that reflects off of things, is almost always a white color, or based on the color of the light. So the fact that it's orange here, it makes it feel like there's this very warm orange light that kind of feels a little unnatural. It feels like the lighting is being used to color the scene versus the set is being used to color the scene, if that makes sense. So those would be my main notes. Even here, like very bright spot there. And yeah, so see here how there's no light right there, but then there's super intense light right here on the window. That doesn't quite make sense. Where's that light coming from, and why isn't it hitting different areas? So check your values, your color values, check your visual contrast, and then think of where the light sources should be. Where is that light coming from, and how can we use that to direct the eye of the audience? So hopefully that helps in there. Now, in terms of render speeds, that was the second part of the question. The question was what to set your sampling at. So for anyone who doesn't know, samples in Maya and in Arnold and most rendering engines basically determine the amount of quality that you're going to get in a render. You want to set these samples high enough so that you don't get any noise in the render, but not so high that your render time gets super huge. And the person here was mentioning that the renders were taking close to 9 to 10 minutes per frame, which is huge. And this is again why rendering is a time sink. When a recruiter sees that your shot is rendered, rendering takes time. You're usually going to be rendering a few minutes per frame. If you've got 200 frames, that's like if each render takes, let's say, 5 minutes, and you're rendering 200 frames, that's 1,000 minutes that you're going to be rendering for, not including composition time and all of that stuff, and re-rendering, because sometimes shots will screw up and you have to re-render it. So that's a lot of time that you could have been doing something else. But let's say again, YouTube channel, or you want to show this publicly, we want to render, but we want to keep our speeds decent. We don't want to just crank this up to get a really nice quality, but then suffer through like a 10-minute render per frame. That's a long time. 6 frames and you've already got an hour, and you've still got another 200 frames left to go. That sucks. So how can we improve our renders and still get rid of that noise? Well, the first thing I'm going to link here is this article on Arnold. So if you're using Arnold, this is one of my favorite articles to go through. It shows you the workflow of getting rid of that noise. So for example, here you can see we have an image here filled with noise. It's all of this like pixelation to it. What we want is a render like this, nice and smooth and crisp and clear. Big difference. So how do we determine that? Essentially, it is trying to figure out our camera samples. And what we need to use is AOVs, which are arbitrary output variables, I believe that's what it stands for, to find and render out specific passes of our shot to determine where that noise is coming from. So you would do a pass on your diffuse, which is the color of the shot. You would do one on your specular, and you would use those to bump up the values until you see no more noise in that specific sample. That's the word I'm looking for. So I would recommend bookmarking this article if you're interested in Arnold rendering. It's very nice and helpful. But I'm actually going to show that in Maya here so we can actually see the process and what you're looking for. So let me set up here. Okay. So there we go. Hopefully you guys can see that. I'm actually using my Cintiq here to do this demo on. Hopefully the audio is going to be okay. This way we can render without it affecting the stream. So I've got this very simple scene here. We've got a cube, a sphere, and a torus that's just been set up here. And I just added a few different materials and created a very basic lighting setup to it. So first of all, let's go and double check our samples. You can find your samples under render settings, right here, Arnold renderer, and here are our samples right there. If I turn these down, so we'll go one sample. If you turn them off to 0, that means it's not going to render that whole thing. So for example, if I put my diffuse samples to 0, the diffuse color, which is the base color of the object, is not going to render. So you need at least one sample here. Okay, so let's do a quick render. Now, when you're doing an Arnold render, the important thing that can really help your workflow is don't use the default render view, which is right here. If I open up the render view here, this is the Maya render view. And it's nice for quick renders, but if you want to have more control, open up the Arnold render view. So go to Arnold and open up render right here. And here we have our objects. So I made a chrome sphere, a plastic cube, and then a kind of frosted glass donut. And this was super quick. I literally just a few minutes before the stream, I threw these together here. So nothing fancy. But we've got this. And as you can see, there's a lot of noise. There's just all of this pixelation, and it's kind of small just to keep the render speeds quick, but let's make that a little bit bigger so everyone can see. Okay, so we've got that. Now, how do we improve this? How do we make this a better render without going too far and too crazy in terms of the amount of times it takes? Well, there are two different ways you can do it. The first and the newer, kind of better way of doing this is under your render settings, go under, let's see. There we go. Under System, Device Selection right there, and do a GPU render. A GPU render is a better way of rendering. It's faster in most cases, especially with newer video cards. It's insanely fast. And you don't have to worry about samples as much. So I can't do it here because this video card on this machine doesn't support GPU rendering, unfortunately. But essentially what you would do is switch this to GPU, and under here, you'll notice that you don't have access to all the samples anymore. They're grayed out. The reason for this is GPU rendering does not calculate samples per group, so diffuse, specular, transmission. It doesn't do that. You just had your global samples right here, so, or I should say your camera samples. You would set this to a good amount, so a typical render might be around 4 to 6, somewhere around there. And that'll get you a good render, but it'll still be pretty noisy. The reason is certain areas will require more samples to use. Again, I wish I could show this, but this video card is old on this computer. So the magic that GPU sampling comes with is you can turn on adaptive sampling right here. When you turn this on, basically what Maya will do when it's rendering is go, okay, there's some noise in this section of the render. I'm going to bump up samples just for that, up to a certain amount. So you would just take your max camera samples here, AA, and bump those up. It's not going to do it all the time, but it's only going to go to a certain point. So for example, if it's rendering here and it notices there's some noise right in here on this torus, it's going to go, okay, I'm just going to bump up samples for that section right there, while the rest stays down at 4. That saves a lot of time because it's only adding it where it needs to. And you'll basically just bump this up until you get to a point where you get a nice clean render. The other thing that helps with this is lowering the adaptive threshold. This basically determines at what point is it going to calculate and kind of go, okay, there's still some noise here. The default value is okay, but I find that 0.1 is usually a little bit better. 0.01, I should say. So you can tone that down a little bit. You can also clamp the samples. That can help avoid what's called fireflies. You can kind of see them here. There's super bright little like spots on this object. Those are called fireflies. Clamping the samples can help, but usually you can get away with that just by getting your samples correct here. And then, yeah, that's pretty much it. So that would be the GPU method of rendering. You just set this to GPU, set your camera, your AA, both of these, and you render. And usually it's pretty quick. It's pretty fast. Now, with that said, I have seen some scenes where it just doesn't work. GPU rendering, no matter what, it just keeps getting artifacts and keeps getting this noise no matter how much you increase it. If you are getting a scene like that, or and maybe you're like me and you have an older video card and you need to use CPU, let's actually go over the CPU method here. So the CPU method is a little slower, but you have more control over the individual elements, which is actually very powerful in its own right. So let me turn this off, and I'll turn off adaptive sampling right here so we get that just base render here. And there we go. So that's our base render. Now, how do we figure out where that noise is coming from? Because to improve the noise, all I have to do is increase my samples. So if I do that, look at that. Oh, already much prettier. But you'll notice that the cube has some noise in here. The torus definitely has some noise. There's noise all over the scene, and all of that noise is being generated by different things, different samples here. And I don't want to just increase this globally, just crank this up to a huge amount, because all I'm doing is slowing things down. I want to get this to be as noise-free as possible, but with the fewest amount of samples as possible. So how do we determine this? To find this out, we need to set our AOVs. So let me set this up here. So to find your AOVs, it's in your render settings right here, AOVs, right there. And you've got a whole list of them right here. So these are all our available AOVs. These are basically different views that you can see of your render. When you're rendering, the render is going through a lot of different passes. And what we see here is what's called the beauty AOV. It's the everything combined into one nice pretty image that we would normally expect to see. We can separate this into all the different elements. So, for example, let's take our diffuse and add that in. So I added this into the available AOVs, and now in my render view here, we have the diffuse AOV. Now if I look at this, look at that. This is just the pure diffuse color. No reflections, no specular, no subsurface scattering, nothing. It is just the diffuse color. And if we go back to our samples here, it is basically showing us this, just the diffuse. So with this, I could then bump up my diffuse up until I get no more noise in there. Now, a better one to look at actually, so the ones I usually look for in here, we've got our alpha channel. So let me find that here. Alpha, I believe. Well, actually alpha, we don't need that because that's already in here. You can see it right there. We're not going to need that right away, but we can check that later. Indirect diffuse. So I've got a list here. The list is in the in that article that I linked earlier. Oh, not that one. Direct. No, diffuse indirect. Let's add that. Let's add our direct and direct specular and direct diffuse. So diffuse direct, specular direct. Basically direct and indirect is the light that's bouncing off of the object versus the light that's bouncing on the object. Then we have transmission. This is going to be anything that's transparent. Subsurface scattering, SSS. And then volume. This is for any like air density kind of rendering stuff. So we've got that. Diffuse, let me double check. Indirect, direct, specular, indirect, transmission. Okay, that's good. So once again, look at that. We've got all of these passes now. If I look at this, so there's our diffuse direct, which we had seen earlier. We have our diffuse indirect right there. So this is the light that's bouncing off of objects right back onto these. So bouncing off of the background, for example, the floor, then bouncing up onto the cube there. We've got our specular, which is just the shines of the objects. Our subsurface scattering, you can see we do have a little bit on this cube. Transmission, that's the transparency. And then volume. We've got no volume right there. So already, just looking at the volume, that tells me that, hey, I don't need volume indirect. Boop, 0. Why add more samples when I don't need it? So now, essentially what I'm going to do is just go through each one, and I can bump up my samples to get just what I need. So let's actually bump up our AA samples here. This is the, you could kind of see them as the global samples on your shot. So let's see how that looks here. Okay, not bad. We'll put it up to 4. It's not too much there, but we're still getting a lot of noise. So let's take a look at our indirect diffuse first. Diffuse indirect. Okay, lots of noise in there. Now, is this specifically for Arnold or for Maya's default render? This is specifically for Arnold. The default Maya render is not going to have any of these. The default Maya render or hardware render are, well, the default Maya render is basically, it lets you get a render. It's not really good. And the hardware render is like taking a screenshot of your viewport. It's very nice for if you just want to like get a pose out and just get essentially a screenshot without having to hit the print key on your keyboard or any of that. So this is going to be our diffuse indirect goes into diffuse right here. So let's raise that up a bit, see what we get. Okay, already that's a lot better. Still a little noisy, but not too bad. Now, each time you increase these, it's going to increase your render time. So be very aware how much you're putting into this. Also, I need to be aware that this is not the final size of my image. This is. So I'm rendering quite small. When you're setting up renders, don't make huge, like full HD renders right away. It's just going to waste time. Instead, make a tiny little render, get all of your settings close to where you need, then you can make a full size render and fine tune it. Essentially, when you're doing rendering takes a long time. As you go, every step is going to be longer and longer and longer. So you want to work in a way that you can get a lot of things done very quickly and then just fine tune the little things versus trying to find big changes and like, okay, make a big change. Wait a minute to render out a full HD image. Let's see, do you have to tweak all of the parameters for each scene or can you use one preset everywhere? You would do this for every scene. And you can even do this for every object, which I'm going to show a little sooner. And that's where you really get to refine your render times. So let's go through here. This is why rendering, you do this for the public, never for your demo reel, because there's a lot of time spent in here. RenderMan is also cool to use. That RenderMan is going to be a lot more like Arnold. So you're going to have a lot of the similar features, just they're called different things or they're under different categories, but they're very similar. I think Marmoset is also pretty good and pretty similar. So let's say we've set that up here. Now the next thing we can look at is our direct specular. So that's going to be our specular noise here. So right there, you can see there's some specular going on. Noise right in there. So let's up that just a bit. Maybe a little bit more. Okay. I'm glad I'm doing this on another computer, because if I was doing this on the same computer that I was streaming on, my computer would explode. So you can see it's taking quite a bit longer, but hey, we're getting better samples right in there. It's not quite as noisy. It's still a little bit, but I don't want to bump this up to the point where we're spending like 5 minutes waiting for this to render out. Now we can go into the next one, would be the direct diffuse right here. Now this is going to be your shadow detail, not so much the color, but you'll notice that there's this graininess in the shadow itself. This is something that I see a lot of people when they start rendering, they miss out on. The shadows, The detail in the shadows comes from your lights. So to set this up correctly, what you need to do is select your light, go into the attribute editor, and in here, right there, your light has samples as well. Every light will have samples. You need to increase this to improve your shadow detail. So if I increase this, let's go, 2 should be pretty good. Okay, that's a little bit better. Let's go 3. And then let it render out. You can see the bottom here that the percentage bar is taking longer and longer. There you go. Much smoother shadows now. Right in there. See, spending 8 hours optimizing render time to save 1 hour render time. Exactly. That's pretty much it. So you've got that now. Now we can do the indirect specular, or let's see. Direct specular we've done, and then indirect specular. Oh, I forgot that one. So let's go in here. Specular indirect. That's SS. Specular indirect. There we go. How's that? That's actually pretty good. I think that, so that goes into the specular here. I think that's pretty good overall. Okay. Now, subsurface scattering. That's going to be for the plastic here. Can raise that just a bit. Subsurface scattering takes a long time. Honestly, this is probably one of the biggest things that's just going to be a time sink in terms of rendering. It takes a lot of calculation. This is also where GPU rendering goes a lot faster when you're doing subsurface stuff. It just calculates much better. So that's a little bit better. There's still some noise, so I might raise that up to 3. And then we've got transmission. That's definitely going to have to go up. Probably, I'm assuming up to 4, if not higher. So that's going to be the transparency of the object. And I should mention, I was looking at specular direct for my specular. You should be looking at specular indirect. So when you're looking at your diffuse samples and specular samples, so diffuse goes to diffuse indirect, specular goes to specular indirect. You want to look at the indirect ones, not the direct ones. That's going to get you a better idea of how things look. Okay. Well, that's a lot better here. Now it is frosted glass, so there should be a texture to it. So that's fine right there. So these are pretty good values. And I've kept my maximum here. You can see the maximum samples right here, the total right there. It's still pretty low. I haven't had to crank this up a huge amount. Now, if we look at our beauty pass, much nicer. Look at that, nice and crisp and clear. And we've cranked our samples in to just be where they need to be. Now, if I wanted to make sure that it's even better, I can just push the camera AA, and that takes everything. So you can see the numbers here. So diffuse samples right there. If I raise this one or lower this one, you can see it only affects the diffuse right there. If I raise the camera AA, all the values change. So if I move this up 1, now I've just increased everything, and now I should have no noise whatsoever. If I felt like maybe I just had a little bit more, I could do that. And now I should have a super crisp and clear render, and I'm not just using values that I don't need. So this is the way to tie in your rendering so that you maximize your quality you maximize your quality and minimize the amount of time rendering per frame at a base level. Now, what version of Maya do I use? I'm using 2020. I do have 2022, but I haven't used that too much yet because there's a lot of issues with rigs, and it's just a little too new. A lot of plugins aren't quite set up for it yet. So I always like to hold off on updating and using another version until the other one has been out for a while. So, nice, crisp, clear render. Great. Now I'm going to tone this down here just a little bit so we can get a little bit more speed. And let's go over another way you can improve your renders. So we mentioned already, you can do a GPU render. And in order to do that, you'd use your camera AA as well as adaptive sampling. If you're using your CPU, you would figure out your samples here and check out all of the different AOVs to figure out exactly where you need more detail. Great. But how else can we speed things up? Well, one of the big things is realizing that not everything has to be rendered on every frame. So, for example, let's say I had, well, actually, let's go here. We'll use this as an example here. So in this scene, we've got the character in the foreground. He's moving things in the foreground. We've got this reflection here on the base here. Great. But does it all need to be rendered every single frame? The background doesn't interact with anything. The character has no interaction with the background in this whole scene. If we kind of play through this, you can see they go through, no interaction whatsoever. Why do we need to render that every single frame? Why do we need to render the glass on the clock every single frame? We don't. We don't need to render this back wall over here. At the end of the scene here, do we need to render the stairs and the back here? It could literally be a still image and no one would know because there's no movement there. There's nothing changing back there. Additionally, when we set our samples, do we need all of the samples throughout the scene to be the same everywhere? So for example, let's take a scene here. So when you're rendering the character here, for example, you're going to need your subsurface scattering, your specular, and your diffuse. But will you need transmission? No, he's not transparent. The bottles are, though. So when we're rendering this character, why do we need to add more transmission samples for rendering him? It's not necessary. It just takes more time. So what we essentially want to do is split up our scene so that we have certain areas that we can simplify the rendering on. Essentially, we want to make layers to things. And the way you can do this is right here at the very top, you have render layers. I believe it's under Windows, rendering editors, and then render setup right here. Right there. Now let me refresh this so it's totally fresh. There we go. So this is what it basically looks like. By default, when you create a render, it's going to render everything all at once. But let's say we know that on this scene, the background is not going to change whatsoever. It's not the greatest example here because the objects are right on the background. But let's say we know that this background element is not going to change. All we need is one render of it, and then we can composite it behind. Is good. So for example, the background here, imagine that this was a render, that I'm a fictitious character and it's all rendered. That whole background there, it could be a still image. One render, done, moving on. That saves a whole lot of time. Look at all that detail that you don't have to render every single frame. Okay, how do we do that? Well, you can't just turn off the visibility. That's the big thing. So if I turn off the visibility here, I'll take my object right there, turn off the visibility. Look at what happens to my objects. They lose their elements. Like there's no more red shine on anything. The sphere, the chrome sphere, has no red in it. We're losing that whole aspect of the render. We cannot just turn the visibility off. But what we can do is add an override. So to set up your render here, essentially what you want to do is create a new collection. So right there. So we're going to create this new layer and we'll call this, let's call this objects. Okay. So this is just going to be our objects in the scene. So we've got this layer. Within the layer, we'll create a collection. This is going to be a collection of objects. And this is going to be, let's call this object. My keyboard is way off. So object, and we'll just call this collection. Okay. And I'm going to add my objects into it. So I'm going to select my objects and hit add. There they are. Great. Now let's add our floor. So if I click on this eye icon, you'll see this now selects all of these, and now it only renders those. Only those things in this collection here in this layer. That's my main scene layer. If I click the eye icon here, if my computer wants to let me click, there we go. It brings it back. So this layer, it's only got these objects. Well, I need the floor in there. Right now you can see the floor isn't showing up. We don't want that. So let's go back to our scene collection here. I'm going to stop the render so it speeds things up just a little bit. For some reason my tablet doesn't, there we go. My tablet doesn't like clicking up there. Okay, so let's add another collection in here. I'm going to create another collection, and this is going to be the floor. Okay, so select the floor, add that in there. Now, why did we have the floor and the objects all separate? If we click on this now, it should bring in our floor. Let's reset our render there. There we go. Haha! It's rendering normally now. Why did we split them? Well, when you split these into collections, what you can do is you can add an override to a collection. This is going to be essentially a way to override certain attributes or even materials of these objects within that collection. So for the floor here, what we want to do is go to the attribute editor, and for the floor plane, go under render stats and take your primary visibility. Middle mouse drag that into the add override section right here. You'll see it gets added right there. Now I can just turn that off, and look at that. The floor is gone. It's not rendering. If we check out the alpha, you can see it's not there, but it's still rendered as if it is. All of the objects still inherit the color from the object, all of the details that would come in through there. There you go. Now I can just render these objects, do a simple render pass on just these, just get the AA samples, or sorry, just the samples for these objects without the floor. Done. Then do a pass on the floor. The floor doesn't have any diffuse, or doesn't have any subsurface scattering, anything like that. I can literally just put a few diffuse samples and specular samples, and I'm done. So we've got that. Well, let's do one for the floor now. So we'll create a new layer, and we'll call this floor. And I should put layer in here. I always like to add like a descriptor, because you can have the floor object, then the floor layer, and the floor collection. I always like to do that. Okay, so I'm going to just take these. We can just copy these and paste them into our floor layer right there. That way we don't have to create them all from scratch. Let's get rid of this override. And now we want to add the override onto the other objects. So I'm going to take my object collection, primary visibility, middle mouse drag it in, and primary visibility, turn that off. Now, let's activate this layer. There we go. We just get the floor, but no objects. There we go. I could do a render pass on that. And once again, if I look at this, we don't need volume, we don't need transmission, we don't need subsurface scattering, we need our specular, these are our lighting, our direct objects here, that's our samples from our lights, and then we'll need diffuse. So to speed up my render now, when I'm just rendering this floor pass, I can just take these and go boop, boop, done. That's a whole lot less samples that I have to render out. So for example, let's put this back to where it was. I think this was 3. Our total samples here, if I was trying to render this at a good speed, is going to be 784 maximum samples just to render this floor. If I turn these down, 528, a lot less samples. And I can render the whole background much faster. So you can do that very easily, very quickly. So let's set that back up here. Okay. So these render layers are going to make a huge difference in your render speeds. And then essentially you just composite them together in something like DaVinci Resolve or Adobe Premiere or Adobe After Effects. You could use that as well if you have that. And you're good. And you've saved a lot of time. It's more work in advance, but if you're rendering a long project, this is going to save you days of rendering. And if something goes wrong, you can just render that one element. So for example, let's go back to this scene right here. Maybe I would do a render element of the background, of the back wall, and maybe this front wall here because nothing changes there. I would make another render layer for the clock, and one for the character, one for the front pieces here. I render all of those out. Now let's say after I do all of that, I find out, you know, that clock just doesn't read well. We can't read what's happening on that clock. Dang it, I need to re-render the clock. Could you imagine if I had just done it on one layer? I'd have to redo everything. Everything has to be re-rendered just to fix this one clock. Or I render the clock layer, done. Everything else stays the same. So you save a whole lot of time, especially when it comes to re-renders. See, will Arnold use memory for hidden objects? Like if I have a fuzzy character, a furry character, and I don't have enough memory to render all at once, it'll use some memory, but not as much. It does have to keep it in memory because it is still calculating it. So for example, you can see here, the objects are still casting shadows. It's just going to be doing less work on it. So if you have a furry character, something that's got a lot of fuzz or lots of detail, maybe lots of hair detail, and you're running out of memory, you could try splitting the scene even more. So for example, if I know that that background there is not affecting my character in any way, just turn off the visibility of it completely. Not just in a layer, just actually turn off the visibility. Now, another thing that's very useful for these layers is that you can use them to create material overrides. So this is more for testing purposes when you want to compare like different materials or just different render setups, or maybe even just have a blank, let me say that in a normal way, a blank version of your render. So maybe I want this render, but I just want to see like the geometry just on a gray background. What I can do, let's rename this here. Let's call this gray layer. And I'm going to create a new collection. So right click, create collection. And I'm going to add all of our objects here. Oop. And then hit add right there. And now I'm going to right click on the collection here. And I'm going to add a material override. Essentially, this is going to take the current materials, the glass, the plastic, the chrome, and switch it out for another one. So now I can just find my material here. So I'm going to open up my Hypershade. Do I have my Hypershade open here? Okay. And I created a basic Arnold material right there. I'm going to middle mouse drag that in to my override material right there. Now, if we click on the layer here, see. Oh, and for some reason it didn't accept it. Let's just make a new one. Let's go through here and actually make sure I plug my beauty pass as well. So let's just add a basic AI standard surface right there. Now the lighting on here is going to be a little too strong for this. So let me open up my Hypershade, find our AI standard surface here. And no, I don't want to install updates. And let's just turn down our specular and our color. Okay. Let's see, make sure I'm actually on the right material here. So override AI standard 6 right there. I think that's the right one. AI standard, oh no, that's standard 1. Oh yeah, it's taking that. So let's see, maybe I can just take this and there we go. Now I've got the right one. So I can tone this down. And now we've got our scene just in gray with nothing else. And I can switch back and forth. So it's like, okay, take a look at my scene. How's the layout looking? Okay, let's bring back our objects. Let's see how that feels. Okay, look at that. Let's look at our floor. Back to gray. Or if I want everything, we've got our main layer right there at the top. There you go. So render layers can help a lot and give you a lot of variation in how you kind of view the objects. So I like to do this a lot when I'm rendering, especially putting the layers and splitting the scenes. It's going to speed up your renders so much, especially the re-render aspect of it. So that's going to be huge. Now, the other thing to watch out for is I was talking about earlier on this shot here, how everything kind of feels the same visually in terms of the tone and the contrast of the scene. In your render view, there is a cool view that it will help you determine whether things are kind of looking a little flat, which is if you click right here, you can switch the different modes of your shot. So you can switch it to alpha mode, which in this case, we don't have an alpha. You can right click here. So all that's going to be normal. And then you can right click red channel, green channel, blue channel. What I like is the Luma value. If you turn this on, you can kind of see just black and white. That's really what it does. But you can see where the values are starting to become too similar. So for example, let's take the cube here. And let's take its color. And I'm going to go back to our RGB channel. So let me double check something. Okay. So we can see that the cube, it's on top of the red. It stands out really nicely. But if I tone this down here, maybe make it a little darker. Let's kind of go quite a ways here. That can still stand out pretty well. But if I look at my Luma value, you can see how it's starting to become very similar in terms of color contrast and value contrast to the background here. It's not standing out. It's not popping like it used to. I like to use this a lot to make sure that my lighting is making the objects stand out versus the objects just fading away into the background. So if essentially you're just looking at your shot in as many different views as possible. So for example, one thing I could do, and this is going to kind of ruin things, is push this so that the value of the cube here matches the value of the shadow and the reflection right there. It's becoming more and more kind of similar. I don't want that. I want to make sure that there's this distinction in terms of value. Once I have that where I want, I can always just go back to my all channels. And now I know that not only does it separate out in terms of visual contrast, red and green and the color, but in value contrast. That is very, very important. I actually used that quite a bit. I did a quick render of a sculpt I had done. Let me go over here. So, where's the images here? Okay. So I did this render a while back. I didn't get to finish it completely. You can see there's some noise in the character right there. But I did this render, and one of the things that I kept noticing as I was doing it is that the character never really stood out well from the background. They just kind of blended in. And that's where I used that Luma value to figure out what elements were just blending in. Essentially, the sword was blending into the background because it was blue, but also her shirt, the red, even though it's a very distinct color from the blue, my first pass on it, which I don't think I still have that first pass, it didn't pop. There was no contrast. They had the same basic value. And then the other thing that I did with this is we've got the color version, and then you can see material override. I just created this plastic kind of resin material so I could see what this thing would look like if I did a 3D print of it. So there you go. And you can do all of these different passes very easily. So yeah. I think that basically covers all the stuff that I wanted to go over in terms of rendering. So the main thing, like I said, is making sure that you get good color contrast. As you're looking at your shot, you want to make sure that things stand out, that your character is being enhanced, your scene is being enhanced by your lighting, not taken away. And then in terms of speeding things up, it's setting your AA samples and your other samples correctly, or using GPU rendering. And then whether you're using CPU or GPU, set up your render layers. It might seem kind of a pain at the beginning, but it's going to save you a lot of time later on. So much time. So yeah, hopefully that helps, and hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, rendering is a lot of fun. I do love rendering. I will say that. There's so much that you can just dive into. And this is kind of like a surface level still. There's so much we could dive into. We didn't even go into, like, we looked at a little bit of light samples. You can start going into volume of the lights. You can start going into all sorts of other elements. But this at a base layer will allow you to get good speeds and good quality without having to like dive into the nitty-gritty of it all. Do I have time for a small critique? I want to do the analysis first, and then we'll see if we have enough time. Because I was supposed to do it last stream and I didn't get to it, so I want to make sure I get to it today. But afterwards, I'd be happy to take a look if we still have some time left. Now, I think I missed a question here. Different subject, but if you're using AE or Nuke, then you can really save time only rendering only what you need, not the whole scene. Yes, that is huge. Like I was saying, you could just render specific elements like the clock in this scene, and if something's wrong, you can re-render that, put it back into the composition, and you're good. You don't have to re-render everything. Even like just the watch. Maybe you rendered everything out and you noticed, oh no, the watch is all wrong. There's noise on the watch, and what do I do? Well, just make a watch layer, render only the watch at a higher quality, maybe change the colors or the material if you want, and then overlay it. Done. Easy. So yeah, that's basically it. It really saves a lot of time and makes rendering more, what's the term I'm looking for? It protects you from errors that might come along the way, because as you render, there will be things that come up. So you're going to be rendering your shot and you're going to hit render. Okay, I'm going to go to bed. Wake up the next morning. The render's done. You sit down and halfway through you notice, oh no, something broke. Maybe the record player here, there's something on it that just doesn't look good. Great, I have to do the whole render over again. Or you just do the record. Done. And the record, in this case, if you actually look at it, the amount that the character is interacting with it, at this point, you might not need to render it anymore. Unless you're getting some direct like interaction with the lighting or the shadows, at this point here, you could just render the section that the character is interacting with. As soon as they pull away, it's a still image and it just holds. Done.